it seems like zone specifically on the PKC app our standard lines work like extremely effectively in terms of like I'm winning a lot of hands, right? So they say my 1-1 soft flop is 65%. I don't know how they're calculating that. Like it might be a little bit off. It might actually be not actually be 65%. And it sort of feels like it can't be because that's like absurd. But that's the highest that I see out of, like when I click on people's thing, that's the highest that I see out of anyone's on that site. And I guess my question is, at what point do these guys realize that like why is he winning all these hands? Like he has to be bluffing like everywhere, right? And just start, like at what point is the number gets so high that the other players like realize that I have to be doing something weird and adjusting. And so I guess the question is, the root question, or the base question, let's say the base question is, are there things that I could do that would decrease my 1-1 soft flop percentage without having a measurable effect on win rate? And then I guess the deep question on that is, does it even matter? Like is there some point, like, should I just be hammering them and then like marking the 5 out of the 100 person pool that I think are even picking that up?
In the spirit of approaching the problem from the way that we talked about this type of paranoia stuff before, let's lay it out on the table and try to dismantle the credibility of stuff that doesn't deserve our attention yet. So the two questions I think are, there's really one question. How much is 1-1 soft flop affecting the resilience of a red line aggressive strategy? Because we're clearly over-aggressing post, and the paranoia is that anybody who understands a 65% 1-1 soft flop, anybody who understands the implication of that, should start bluff catching very aggressively versus post flop.
Or the thing I get concerned about is slow playing.
Okay.
And it's funny because it's a site where no one, I feel like almost no one is value betting effectively. Like they're too tight in their value bets. Like even river checkbacks. Like I've seen some absurd hands that they've shown down where it's like, come on, like you didn't realize that you could value bet that hand? Like that's ridiculous. And so when I see someone check flop or turn or like an earlier street with a hand that should have been value bet, I wonder, it's like, are they doing that because they see my 1-1 soft flop and they're like, this is a guy that's over aggressive, so I don't know if they're thinking about it on this level, but at least like the caveman thing is like, well, he's betting too much, so I'm just going to check a strong hand. The more technical, well thought out one is like, I can generate more EV by letting him fire off than I'm going to generate by just value betting the hand myself. Like, and so I guess the question is, when I see a hand that was like a clear, in my mind, a clear slow play, are they doing that because they're a player that just doesn't value bet enough, or are they doing that because they're a player that's interpreting that 1-1 soft flop?
Cool. I would start from approaching it by assessing the degree of information exchange that has occurred between you and the specific player. So first thing I would ask is, what statistical information do they have access to? Is it a running? They don't have session by session. They don't have like multiple session vision, right?
It has it. Yeah, it's long term.
Okay.
It has your total VPIP.
So can they take a note on you that sticks?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
And that the 1-1 soft flop is not a session stat. It's a long term stat.
Right. So they have the ability to note take and a running 1-1 soft flop BPIP filter on you, basically, a stat. And you have the ability to know who they are after a session in every next session.
Yes.
Okay, so here's how I approach this. Because it's quite similar to just a known reg environment at that point, except the interface is providing them with a stat that makes you an anomaly, which might make it more easy for them to identify that you're over aggressive. There's a couple things need to happen that we need to point out as assumptions. The player needs to understand that 65-1-1 soft flop is high. Probably not that hard if he's watched any tutorials on stats.
Yeah, or he can just look at his own, right?
He can look at his own and compare it. Step 2 that we need to at least highlight is he would need to understand the proper counter to that, or what the implication is of that. So first he has to know it's high. Then he has to know it's not because you're a raging nit who just gets to the flop pushing way too much equity. Right. It's because you're actually bluffing way too much.
Right. They should also be able to look at my VPIP stat.
What is it?
And it's like 30. It's not absurd high, but that's for a zone pool at 100 NL. Like that's rather high. Like I would almost assume that someone with that VPIP is a fish.
Right. At least trending.
Yeah.
That's fair. And then the third level would be, do they know how to properly counter that? Which isn't that hard, but it is an extra degree of...
There are levels of the counter as well, right?
So the first thing I would look for to create a strong argument that we're dealing with a player who's adjusted in the way that you're afraid he might have adjusted to you. 2 things. Slow playing premium hands, because those are the hands that usually stand out as the most intentional counters to a strategy like the one that you're imbalanced with.
Yeah.
So is he checking back sets in position? Is he checking really strong hands to you out of position? That is a information exchange that generally would give me a higher Bayesian confidence that he's countering you over lower sample sizes, which is what I'm really looking for in order to make a note, basically, that I should be adjusting. And then the other one's really cool, his river timing when he calls you.
I like that, yeah.
Because that's indicating a psychological shift where he's just like, fuck you, buddy, you bluff too much.
Yeah.
And starts snapping you. That's a huge tell, especially if he's doing it with a marginal strength hand that is mixed or...
And you can extrapolate that to the slow play as well, right? Is he thinking and then slow playing, or is he just snap checking back the hand?
Right. Premeditated,
right.
Slow play. Yeah, exactly. So those 2 things I think give a lot of insight over shorter samples. Over larger samples, I think you're just going to have to start paying attention to how much your bluffs are failing.
Yeah.
And at that point, like, I literally, on known sites, I will just create a label, a note tag, assuming they allow me to use colors, where I'll put a tag on that guy, and that tag tells me that it's probably safe to veer on the side of under bluffing for the next few thousand hands, or until I see some information exchange that indicates that this guy is no longer really interested in continuing to look me up aggressively. Because what's my alternative? I either have to figure out how to play a very well organized, balanced strategy, or I have to continue to justify that I can keep unleashing bluffs into him when I'm getting a decent amount of feedback that he's not really folding as much as he maybe used to, or... And so I think it's a combination of the degree of information exchange, the amount of trials you have, combined with the intensity of information able to be gleaned from the showdowns of those trials. And never be afraid to underbluff when you have an inkling that you're up against a reg who you have history with. But this is structural too, because really, in order to really understand why it's okay to stop bluffing, you have to realize that your win rate is being now generated by value betting exploitatively when you anticipate him calling at a higher than optimal rate. And then to go one step further, there are still going to be a lot of zones that I continue to overbluff. They're just not going to be the zones where I feel like he's in a heightened position to be bluff catching.
Right.
So like a lot of the hot spots where I just know that it's really hard for him to continue to, where I know that, so this goes back to almost the first comment. How to counter it is basically him shifting to a strategy that now operates with the intention of exploiting what you're doing.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of on the lookout for that, I guess. And there are things that I would do to try to mix up my lines if I saw this starting to happen. If we're bashing someone over the head with the same weapon, that weapon is going to lose resilience faster than if we're sending a flurry of, different smaller weapons at them. And so there's a dimension of that too. And yeah, you're increasing the complexity of the game, so maybe you're putting yourself at a navigational disadvantage because you're outside of your own comfort zone. But maybe that just means it's at higher stakes, it's better to start studying way more lines that you could potentially be balanced or know what the opponent's imbalance is.
Would you do that like some of the older like P1 lock type strategies where like you're doing a simplification, like you're not running a mixed strategy in an early street, but you're varying the type of unmixed strategy, right? Like where sometimes you might bet 100% and sometimes you might bet 0%, or sometimes you'll bet a mix of hands, but it'll be a certain type of mix.
Like a stronger semi-bluff.
Yeah.
So generally, any strategy simplification that doesn't lose a substantial portion of accuracy by executing it, it's not going to be the type of thing that I adjust versus these guys usually, that I think it might be exploiting me. Like, unless someone is making a habit of check raising my balls off, I'm probably going to continue betting 1/3.
Yeah.
And even if they are, I might throw down with them and be like, okay, buddy, prove to me that you can navigate post flop with a 30% flop check raise range when I have position. Because this hand's not over yet. Just because you looked at PO and it showed you that the max exploit is check raise me 30, I have the ability to recounter on future streets when you're at a positional disadvantage and I have 2 streets and stack depth left to play.
Yeah.
So that's where I differ as a player, and this is stylistic. Like, there are some spots where I would say style doesn't matter. Style collapses into just what is the objective thing to do with the information at hand. We could talk about river bluff catching as one of these spots, where if you put a spot down in front of 4 different players in a vacuum, I think all of the good players should be able to give you the same answer, assuming that spot isn't, equal EV.
Right.
Assuming there's edge, I think we should all arrive at the same answer. But moving backwards towards the front of the game tree, I think there are stylistic options available to you that will funnel players into different portions of the game tree where maybe you have explored it more or just feel like you have a future exploit at your disposal. And I feel like that's something that could be worth playing with. That's my favorite thing to play with right now. Like, because I get to add dimensions to it. Like, I get to 3-bet a flop and actually for the first time look and see how someone's timing when they face that 3-bet flop might affect the progressive fold equity on future streets, and make assumptions about that, and maybe even build a big enough sample to say, hey, when somebody snap calls my flop 3-bet on a 2-tone board, that's extremely draw heavy and capped, and maybe that creates a progressive overfold opportunity that incentivizes me to play for that repolarization on the flop just to gain information.
Yeah.
I like stuff like that, and I think it's the only thing that really keeps my strategy development inspired at this time, because to give you a alternative of where you go once you're at high stakes, you have to almost go into very tedious solver work. I watched a video that Sauce did on a Linus Love hand recently. It was a run at once video, and Sauce is doing a very tedious sim on whether or not a alternate line that Linus Love played was in fact in a mixed strategy or not.
Yeah.
And I looked at it and I was interested by the video, and I thought it was well done, and I thought this is something that is cool to know about. But in terms of when this will become relevant to me as a player who's hunting for win rate, I just wasn't sold that that's where my focus should be.
Sure.
And it was also not the thing that's fun. Like, I'd always rather be on the hunt for the next dimension of the game and pioneering that then I guess I almost feel like it's almost like surrendering to the sim work. Don't get me wrong, I still do sims. But I'm not so surrendered to the sim that I wouldn't be at least exploring a more inspired path that could potentially lead to more win rate. Or this is why I like Tyler Forrester from the jump. When I joined Rio, was like one of the first things he said in one of his earlier posts was like, I've always been someone who really tried to pioneer a new thing before it became mainstream and try to extract as much EV as possible from that thing before it became mainstream.
Yeah.
We see this with stuff like the 1/3 C-bet and checking range out of position. Not everybody's doing it, but it's a way bigger trend than it was 3 years ago before it got hyped up. So I don't have a ton of opinions on style. I think I used to have more, but once I now acknowledge how much the game tree can expand on earlier streets, I see it being almost a choose your own adventure. Where do you want to go with the game tree? Because depending on what options you pick on early streets, that's gonna determine where most of your attention should go on later streets, and we might end up studying different branches of the tree and both being able to achieve the same win rate. Yeah. Because we're just well versed in different avenues.
I'm trying to remember what the guy, what his name was. He's a main event champion. He won the Six Max the same year. He's from Baltimore, or not Baltimore. He's from Maryland. It's oh God, what's his name? I don't know. It'll come to me. Greg Merson. And he said, it was an old interview I saw from him, and he said he would use very strange sizings on the flop in like 500 Zoom or even like the higher stakes cash Poker Stars game. Okay. Because he just wanted to push that person out of a range that they haven't studied.
Yeah, I think it's a good thought, and it will only work against you versus someone who's very well versed in how to calibrate exploitatively, theoretically. So I've never been one to try to develop strategy that's going to be able to compete at the top level, where the assumption is that people are playing extremely well balanced,
right.
GTO almost. And the reason that's never made much sense to me is because if that's the strategy that is incentivized, it means there's very little edge in that arena. So I would rather do something else.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's some passion for some people about playing elegant GTO poker, but at the end of the day, like, my business mind is having just as much fun playing softer pools. So why not play the 10-20 soft game where I can make really good win rate, or just diversify into a completely another industry where I can use my skills in a wider market.
Sure.
I think that's smarter. I'll never encourage anybody to get out of poker. I just see a lot of flaws in players who start from the premise, especially young kids who come into the career thinking, teach me how to play at OTB Red Barons level so I can be on Poker Stars on the wall of fame. You know what I mean? And it's just like, bro, you're coming at this from such a wrong direction that you're going to burn out before you even make NSNL.
Yeah.
All right, I got no suave ending, so